This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states. I want to take a moment to tell you about a podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute called Identity Crisis. This podcast is creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life. It's hosted by Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, who sits down with a wide range of guests, politicians, authors, writers, and more to discuss current events, Jewish values, and the big questions facing Jewish life. This podcast has a genuine curiosity and humility about the critical and complex issues, everything from what it means to be a Jewish leader during this divisive moment to the experience of being a Palestinian in Israel today. You will find Identity Crisis enriching and enlivening. Check it out, Identity/Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signs what would be his final major piece of domestic legislation, and it is a controversial one. It's an omnibus crime bill, which even he admitted he was signing because it contained, quote, more good than bad. And I guess there's part of me that says that should be lauded, that any legislator should be honest that most big bills contain a mix of good and bad. But the nature of that mix says a lot about where the politics of crime was by 1968 and where LBJ was. You can see this bill as marking a clear shift away from some of the war on poverty, grassroots civil rights gains of the mid-60s to, and we've discussed this on the show a little bit, to a little bit of a backlash of sorts in the later part of the decade, a crackdown. And of course, we now can see how the war on poverty shifted to the war on crime, or how those became divergent and sometimes even opposing efforts as we moved into the 70s and the 80s. A lot of those seeds were planted in this moment with this big omnibus crime bill. So here to discuss the last of LBJ's big, not-so-beautiful bills, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
Can I just say that we've done enough episodes of this show where when you find yourself uttering the three-word phrase, omnibus crime bill, maybe not so great things are in store.
No.
Yes. And, we'll get into what's in the bill itself. I want to offer just a little bit of that context. I hinted at it in the intro. Can't be comprehensive here, but I do think just marking this as a signal of a shift from the mid-60s into the late 60s. So obviously, mid to late 60s, a lot of unrest. 67 is the long, hot summer. There was a lot of high-profile violence, racial unrest in cities around the country. A big response to that is LBJ's famous war on poverty. And I think there, amidst all of this, and we've talked a lot about this, the mid-60s, amidst all this, there's a real sort of conversation about the roots of a lot of these problems. And a lot of it is couched in larger, deeper ideas about poverty and racial injustice. In 1965, there's a Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which kind of sets the stage for the federal government having a bigger role in local policing. So we see through the 60s these kind of mix of a conversation about the roots of crime, the roots of displacement, and injustice, mixed with a little bit of some systems coming into place that are going to set the feds up to have a little bit more power. And then the other thing I want to kind of highlight is obviously in 1967 and 68, the politics look very different. There's been elections that have shifted power. Dems are a little bit on their back heel. So just keep in mind, listeners, 66 and 68 are very different moments sort of politically and in the way that the country and elected officials are kind of looking at violence, policing, poverty, and so forth. And then added into all of this, and we've done an episode on it, one of the episodes I kind of think about the most on the show, was this Kerner Commission report. The Kerner Commission report was issued in the wake of 1967, the long hot summer. And, the thing that has struck me, we did a whole episode about this, is how much it kind of looked at all this violence and said, there are deep roots here. And this is about poverty and racial injustice and displacement.
Police brutality.
And largely speaking, it was ignored by the people in power.
They said, great, let's do nothing.
They wrote it and they were like, those are hard problems to solve. Let's try something different.
And maybe even more than let's do nothing. Instead, let's go to this big, comprehensive policing crime bill that, that we're here to discuss. So I know that's a lot of things to keep in mind, but I think we see this sort of shift away from a kind of, I think, honest, nuanced conversation about the roots of crime to this moment here where it's a little bit of, we got to bring the hammer down, we got to clean up the streets, and all that rhetoric that we're sort of used to now.
Yeah, it's a good cop, bad cop moment. No pun intended, but the bad cop is really coming out in this moment. And part of the reason this bill is such a big deal is because it gives so much power to the local and state governments. It gives them so much, for lack of a better word, ammunition in terms of how they handle these protests and rebellions. It starts out by giving them over $400 million over the first 2 years of the bill. And this is to get all kinds of equipment. This is where you get your army tanks and your bulletproof vests and your walkie-talkies and a lot of war material. I mean, these are things that you would have in battle, not necessarily against civilians. Lord willing, not against civilians. But that is what these smaller sort of city and state departments are getting. And the federal government is actually subsidizing this. They're covering up to 90% of the cost for these programs that they believe will sort of prevent riots or rebellions.
Can we just linger on the kind of surplus military equipment making its way back to local jurisdictions? Because, gosh, that feels like the story of policing over the last 15 years in this country, too.
Yeah, and it turns out more than 15 years, right?
Right.
60 years, that the Vietnam War, this idea of bringing the war home was something that not only protesters were doing, but that the federal government was doing as well.
Yeah. And it's such a visual response because when there is unrest, you see what looks like military SWAT teams out in the streets with tanks, with heavy duty gear, with tear gas, with things that, is intended to break up or disrupt, large crowds. But it looks like a military presence because it really is a military presence.
And it's also part of this, it's kind of a two-pronged backlash that's unfolding in this moment, a backlash against the Black civil rights movement, because this language of crime and lawlessness gets its start in the early 1960s against Black civil rights protesters who are breaking the law in order to protest segregation. And so Barry Goldwater in 1964 is running on a law and order platform, but he means people like Martin Luther King Jr. And so it has its origins there, and it's also a backlash against the Supreme Court, which had in the 1960s begun to hand down decisions that protected people who were accused of crimes. And by the time you get to the late 1960s, even the Democratic Party is saying, maybe we've gone too far in protecting people's civil rights and we need to reel some of that back and start having a more muscular state to keep things in line.
Yeah.
So there's some provisions in here that kind of roll back some of the Miranda protections during arrests and so forth. Yeah. So, I think we start to see a story of kind of let's unleash police forces a little bit and arm them and
not just arm them, but also surveil people. I mean, wiretapping, there's more money for wiretapping, which becomes a huge legal issue. But I feel like wiretaps are the precursor to body cameras in some ways. I mean, it was a way of surveilling the communities, of getting sort of secretive feedback that they could then weaponize against certain groups like the Black Panther Party, which are about to come on the scene in this year, in this moment. It becomes a really difficult time to be an activist.
Here's a quick question for you. Did your high school do an annual musical? Does me asking that bring you back? There's kind of a special magic to it, isn't there? The auditions, the drama, the big feelings, the sense of the whole school coming together. If you're looking for a dose of that world and something more, something a little weirder, you don't want to miss We're Doing the Wiz, the latest series from Radiotopia Presents. It's about a very white high school attempting to stage the all-black retelling of The Wizard of Oz. and the two classmates who now, almost 20 years later, can't stop thinking about it. This is from Ian Koss, one of the great radio makers out there. Along with Sakina Ibrahim, it's full of nostalgia and music and lots of big, complicated ideas, not to mention protests, TV news crews, and a very uncomfortable all-school assembly. To my ear, this series, one of the candidates for Podcast of the Year already. Check out Radiotopia Presents We're Doing the Whiz wherever you listen. When you check in on the news each day, doesn't it kind of feel like every story is a head-spinning economic story? Tariffs, meme coins, budget fights, not to mention groceries and gas prices. Economics is everywhere, fueling our lives even where you least expect it. You're a This Day listener, which means I know you love context and hidden history. Well, Planet Money is the show for you. Planet Money recently did an episode that I absolutely loved, all about the more uncommon economic indicators being discussed on social media. Not just the obvious like prices, but sales of lipstick are going up, babysitter buns are coming back into style. A show like Planet Money is built to dig into all the little ways that economics shapes our lives. Every episode of Planet Money is fun, illuminating, and pretty short. 20-ish minutes, and you'll walk away knowing a lot more about how the world really works. Listen now to Planet Money from NPR. I want to take a moment to tell you about the Electronic Frontier Foundation and their podcast, How to Fix the Internet. For 35 years, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has been fighting to make sure that when you go online, your rights go with you. EFF has rescued podcasts from patent trolls, helped encrypt the web to protect your privacy, and prevailed in lawsuits against government secrecy and surveillance. I am a huge fan of their work, and can I let you in on a little something? The laptop that I'm recording this promo on right now has an EFF sticker on it covering the camera. I'm looking at it right now, and I would say at least once a week when I'm working at a coffee shop or something, someone will notice it and say, "Oh, wow, I really love EFF." I have long admired and supported their work to protect our rights online, and I am really excited to tell you about how to fix the internet. If you care about digital rights, privacy, or even just have questions and concerns about how to make technology work for us rather than the other way around, How to Fix the Internet and EFF are here to help. Season 6 is out right now. You can visit EFF.org/podcast to listen. That's EFF.org/podcast for How to Fix the Internet and to join EFF.
It's also fascinating because the omnibus crime bills of the last third of the 20th century include all of these things, right? They're particularly harsh on Black people. They're used against activists. But they also include gun control, something that you do not see in omnibus bills that much anymore. You have the 1968 bill that includes more gun control because it's like we got to get the guns out of the hands of criminals. We've got to get the guns out of the hands of the Black Panthers. And then in 94, when you have the Clinton crime bill, it includes the federal assault weapons ban.
And it undercuts a little bit, this bill, some of the federal oversight of local jurisdictions. So to your point, Kellie, like it kind of just lets local police act a little bit with impunity. So,
and certainly not with restraint and caution, which is what the federal government had advised. But of course, that's not what happens at all.
Right. I mean, there is language in there, right? Literally that says use restraint and caution. But here's a decommissioned M1 tank.
Yeah, I know. I know. You're like, wait, what?
Yeah. Okay, so when I said in the intro that Johnson signs this bill and he says there's some good stuff in here and some bad stuff in here, what does he think is the good stuff in here and what does he think is the bad stuff in here?
Yeah, that is a good question.
Do you have a sense?
I would probably say what he thinks are the good aspects of it are the parts that are much more punitive for protesters, like the ramping up of like police forces. I think he sees that as a win-win, as though no one is going to say, no, the police don't need more protection. No, they don't need bulletproof vests. I think he sees that almost as something that would be like universal or mutually appreciated. Of course, that has a major backlash in the fallout of a lot of these rebellions that happen later. But I think he thinks that this is going to be good, a more public good, that it won't address anything that's in the Kerner Commission. But that's kind of the point. I mean, to bring down like this fist is a way of saying like, I am not going to be soft on these issues. And even though he's not saying law and order, he's showing law and order.
I also think that there's an aspect of the bill that is focused on victims of crime. Like, I think that's the way when Johnson thinks about the good parts of the bill, that's who he's thinking about. He's thinking about the people who aren't going to get held up in an armed robbery because there won't be the same guns on the street. He's thinking of 911, which is a legacy of this bill. We have the 911 system because of this legislation. He's thinking about more responsive police on the streets and how that's going to make people feel safer. And if Americans feel safer, they'll feel more prosperous and they'll be happier and all of these great things. So I think when he's thinking about it, he's not necessarily really thinking about the long tail of it, which is going to be mass incarceration and more police brutality. But he's thinking, well, how are like white people in the city going to be feeling? Yeah. They're going to feel safer, and that's a good thing.
Right. And, I want to get to that long tail in a second, but this is obviously the sort of paradox of LBJ and the reason why, hundreds and hundreds of pages have been written about him. But, it's like the same guy who kind of enacts a war on poverty and passes all this civil rights legislation and sort of seems steeped in the kind of like complexities and the deep roots of poverty and racism in this country, is also someone who's just kind of like, yeah, go out there and knock some heads together and get these ruffians off the street. But there's a real lineage in the Democratic Party of that too. I mean, if you look at the crime bills of the omnibus, the most notorious omnibus crime bill that we've discussed a little bit on this show, but of 1989, some of the most heated rhetoric in that one was from Democrats, who were kind of like tripping over themselves to be quote unquote tough on crime in that way. So let's talk a little bit, Nikki, you hinted at legacy here. I mean, to me, this story is just one that just adds to this really interesting, complicated weaving of both a war on poverty at the same time that you're building a kind of police state. Yeah. And those are like in tension, and the sliders are moving up and down. And I think you can kind of start to see in this moment that one of those sort of wins out.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that we sometimes stress is that people saw this coming at the time with a number of different topics, and this is one as well. The New Yorker talked to a source in 1968 who was talking about the bill, and they said it will certainly damage this country severely, and it could conceivably destroy democracy as we know it. At the very least, it constitutes a great leap forward toward a police state. And I think that language is important because on the flip side of the state of the U.S. that we've been talking about, there was also a ton of concern about police violence and brutality and crackdowns against students and against Black people and against anti-war protesters. This is when you start to get civilian review boards. And so there were people who were ringing the alarm bells at this time. And yet it kind of gets forgotten because it was just a few years ago when a historian that Kellie and I both know well, Elizabeth Hinton, came out with a book called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. And she looks at the Johnson administration, particularly the last few years of his time in office, when he is making exactly this shift from looking at poverty, supporting civil rights, supporting voting rights, and then shifting toward this more carceral, this more punitive approach to state power. So there's a through line, right, which is extensive state power. That's the through line of the Johnson administration. But how that power is being used by the end of his presidency is tilting toward the carceral state. And so what Hinton argues is that sort of built into the war on poverty, using the apparatus of the infrastructure that was built for the war on poverty, Johnson begins to sort of like ease out the poverty programs and sort of seeds in the policing programs. And so he takes that big infrastructure that he's built for the Great Society and turns it into this kind of panopticon for Black people across the United States.
And it's a baton that gets passed from administration to administration because other presidents, both conservative and liberal, pick up that mantle. They double down on it and they keep it going, and it never really wanes. I mean, you can't roll back the sort of military police presence that we see in our very current moment. Is all a part of this sort of origin story of how it gets funding and the supplies that it needs.
And by and large, it tends to be politically really popular. Folks will know that Richard Nixon runs on Law and Order in both 68 and 72, wins in a huge landslide in 72. Reagan runs on Law and Order. Even George H.W. Bush, he has Bill Barr as his attorney general, and Bill Barr writes the case for more incarceration in 1992, and Clinton picks that up, and Reno picks that up, Janet Reno, his attorney general. So there is this kind of bipartisan consensus that policing is good, that law and order politics is good, and that this is really popular politics. And when a party finds itself kind of on the outs, that if it turns to this kind of policymaking, that's its way back into power.
Yeah, which is obviously, a big part of this story, too, the political moment in 1968 when, as we said, Nixon's on the rise, the law and order sort of the backlash is coming. And I think Johnson, would argue, and there's like a huge, long New Yorker profile that's basically about all the political machinations that went into passing this bill. But, Johnson would argue that he had to kind of play the political moment in getting this bill across, too. But yes, this idea that you can sort of couch the tools of social control within the kind of welfare state is really fascinating, and we've seen it play out over and over. And it's a lot harder to stand up there and make a case for sort of social programs than it is to stand up there and sort of rail on about policing and law and order and et cetera. All right, well, let's leave it there. Really interesting. I don't know why we've been talking about the late 60s a lot lately. Who knows?
Can't imagine. But no reason. Coincidence.
Totally not applicable.
Yeah. All right. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.